My name is Jackson, and I'm a third-year med student. Honestly, I always thought of myself as the skeptical kind. Ghost stories, spirits, and haunted places were something you told the kids, or those with overactive imaginations. But, as I learned, there are things that are better left unexplored, especially when you have those kinds of friends who just push you into it. This whole thing was Lucy's idea. She wanted to spend Halloween night in the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The place was infamous, having been shut down many decades ago because of experimental treatments. As time passed, rumors cropped up, until the hospital became more famous for disturbing legends about itself than its real history. To Lucy, a prolific creator of extreme social media content, this was the ultimate in Halloween stunts. We agreed to meet at the hospital just after midnight. Michael, ever easygoing, would lighten any situation with his humor. Sure enough, he was already there when I showed up. Lucy, whose eyes sparkled with the lights from her camera gear, followed. Finally, Sarah came, hanging back a little. Sarah was not quite as thrilled, unlike Lucy, at being here. Still, she had a deep interest in local history, and it had been her doing the digging for the old files about the hospital's past. "All right," Lucy grinned, setting up her camera, "let's make this legendary." The front entrance of the hospital was boarded up, but a loose side window was spotted. After a few minutes of searching, it was loose enough to pry open. We climbed inside one by one, dropping into the dark, stale air of a hallway stretching both ways into darkness. Inside, it was like a time capsule. The walls peeled, thick layers of dust coating the floors. Above doorways, faded hospital signs hung, their words barely readable. Every sound seemed magnified, every whisper of air hinted that someone or something was just out of sight. "This is charming," Michael joked, his voice echoing down the corridor. The deeper we went, the more Lucy filmed and commentated in this very dramatic voice. We went room to room of empty patient rooms, bed frames dusty, chairs old, medical machinery broken. It was so surreal, like walking through the memory of a ghost. A little later, Sarah called us back into a room she'd found. "Look at this," she said, gesturing to a series of medical files that lay scattered across an old desk. They were yellowed with age, the handwriting barely legible. Each file contained information about former patients, the treatments they had received, the conditions they'd had, and in some instances, the dates of their death. "Weird," Lucy whispered, running her flashlight over the names. That is when we noticed something weird. The names on those files sounded familiar. I swear my heart stopped beating for a second when I saw one which sounded just like my name, but written decades back. Other people found similar files, each with their respective names, also with strange symptoms and unorthodox treatments. I wrote it off, the possible coincidence, or maybe somebody adding some fake files to an urban legend. "This is definitely someone's idea of a prank," I said, though I could feel a chill creeping down my spine. We came into a room that somewhat resembled some sort of therapy room. The walls were lined with mirrors, cracked, stained with age, yet still reflecting the poor light emanating from our flashlights. I saw my reflection, but something was off. It reflected back at me with an expression that I wasn't making. It just looked blank, almost vacant. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only my wide-eyed face staring back. "Did anybody else see that?" I whispered, hoping it was just my imagination. Lucy shrugged it off, but Sarah looked unnerved. "There's something wrong here," she whispered, and for once, Lucy didn't disagree. We ventured deeper into the hospital, past a line of examination rooms. That's when we heard it, a faint, echoing noise coming from somewhere deep in the building. It sounded like someone was walking, a faint shuffle of feet against tile. We froze and turned to one another. "Probably just the building settling," Michael said, though by the look on his face, he didn't quite sound convinced. As we continued onward, however, the sounds did not cease. If anything, they appeared to follow us, growing louder with every passing minute. And with each time we came to a stop, the footsteps ceased only to resume the instant we did. Of course, Lucy wanted to capture it all on camera, but even she was beginning to look uneasy as her usual confidence was slowly drained away with every creak of the floorboards. Eventually, we came to a long hallway filled with patient rooms. The doors were open, and as we walked down the hall, I couldn't help but feel that with each room we passed, someone or something was staring back from within those shadows. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling did nothing but worsen. We opened a huge door at the end of the hall with the word "Records" on it. Inside, the room was filled with old cabinets and shelves, most of them empty or broken. On one of the inchoate shelves, however, lay a single dust-covered notebook, lying open. I curiously picked it up and flipped through the pages. That's when I saw it our names, in faded ink, along with today's date. My heart racing, I realized the entries were written as if we were patients, and each entry ended with the words, "Unexpected complications." What is this?" I muttered, my hands shaking as I handed the notebook to Sarah. "This place is just trying to mess with us," Lucy said, though even her voice shook. "Some kind of elaborate prank. That has to be it." But in my bones, something darker stirred. Something that made me wonder if we were all alone out here at all. As we exited the room, I threw one last glance back at the notebook, and that last entry, like it was blurring and shifting, somehow, alive. I shrugged it off, wanting to be out of there as quickly as possible. But as we turned to leave, the door we'd come through slowly creaked shut behind us with a soft, echoing click. In that instant, the hospital exhaled a sigh and appeared to fold us into its dark, twisted bosom. It was a sudden click of the door down the darkened hall that gave chills to all of us. Michael reached for the handle and pulled, but it would not move. The tension mounted as he jiggle-danced with it, meeting the same resistance over and over again. "It's probably just stuck," he said, trying to conceal the growing nervousness. But his words did very little for the rising fear that I could feel nibbling at us all. She shined her flashlight down the hall, an expression of determination set on her face. "Guess we'll just find another way out," she said, acting like it wasn't a big deal. Her confidence bolstered me, despite every fiber in my body screaming that something was very wrong. We walked further, the flashlights danced across peeling walls, the shadows stretched. The hospital grew darker, as if the very building was swallowing up any trace of light that we brought with us. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone, following us, but there was only empty darkness. As we turned a corner, Sarah stopped, her gaze fixed on a door with a faded sign that read, in some forgotten language, "Therapy Room." "This is where they used to conduct experimental treatments," she whispered as dread crept into her eyes. Curiosity finally got the better of us, and we stepped inside. The room was dark, with chairs arranged in a half-circle. There were old, cracked mirrors against one wall, showing dust particles dance around. The weird thing was, the chairs didn't look abandoned, they looked used. As if somebody had been there, waiting. What's this?" Michael muttered, pointing to something etched in the floor in front of each chair. "Names. Patient names, carved into the concrete, each one faded with age but still readable. And one of them was mine. Jackson." I stumbled back, my heart racing as I stared at my own name carved into the floor, dated with today's date. "This can't be real," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lucy tried to laugh it off, the sound fell flat in the oppressive silence. "It's just a prank," she said, trying to sound far more convinced than she felt inside. "Someone probably heard we were coming and thought it'd be funny to mess with us." But I knew as I'd looked around that didn't make any sense. The names were old, the dates worn and scratched as if they had been here long before we ever set foot in the hospital. Michael started to pace, finally tense himself. "We need to get out of here," he said low, eyeing the room warily. His face had paled, his usual humor missing from his features. The air seemed thick, claustrophobic, like the building itself was closing in around us. Coming out of the therapist's room, we were once again faced with a hall that looked just like the previous one. The design of the place didn't make any sense. The corridors seemed to curve and twist with every step taken. The light from our flashlights sputtered on and off, casting weird shadows, which appeared to deepen with each further step. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, pointing ahead of us. There was a door in front of us. Above it, in faded letters, were the words "Observation Room." She pushed it open and continued inside. The rest of us followed. The room was fitted with old recording equipment, the type you'd see in a horror movie. Cracked monitors lined one wall, their screens coated in dust. But one single monitor, was turned on, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. It was a view of the hallway just outside the room. The image was grainy and distorted but unmistakable. "What is this?" I muttered, inching closer to the screen. As I watched, I saw motion, a flutter of a figure passing, just outside the door. My blood ran cold as the figure paused, turned to face the camera. It was a dark silhouette, its face indistinguishable, yet there was something disturbingly familiar about it. It was me. Lucy gasped, covering her mouth as the figure on the screen tilted its head, as if it could see us watching. The image froze, then vanished, leaving the screen blank. My heart pounded as I back away, dread overwhelming in that moment. Did anyone else see that?" Sarah whispered, pale, as she watched both me in the blank screen. Before any of us could process what was happening, we heard footsteps. Slow, calculated footsteps that echoed down the hall. We stood frozen as the sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. Lucy's eyes went wide as she looked around frantically, panic creeping into her expression. "We need to hide," she whispered urgently. We huddled behind the old machinery, hugging the wall. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I stopped my breath until it was about to burst inside me from tension as we waited, hoping that whatever or whomever was on the other side would walk away. But the door creaked open, and I saw a figure step into the room. Instantly, my heart was pounding as this figure stood there, its face obscured by the shadows. It looked wrong, as if it were human but somehow twisted, distorted. The figure took another step forward, and a wave of cold washed over me, the air in the area around us seeming to turn to icy breath stolen from my lungs. The head turned, cocked, as if it were listening, searching. Just as I thought I wouldn't be able to bear to hear anything else, it turned and went away, its steps fading into the distance. For a long while, we didn't say anything, but shook uncontrollably until we were certain that it was well out of sight. What was that?" Michael whispered softly. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We poured out of the observation room and ran down the hall, feet pounding. But the hallways were all different now, twisted, circular. Every turn only led us back to the same spot, and I was starting to feel like the hospital was playing with us, trapping us in its endless maze. Then, if I thought things couldn't get worse, we heard it again, the faint shuffle of footsteps, deeper in the hospital this time. This time, though, there were voices, too, whispering our names in soft, chilling tones that sent shivers down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucy nodded, pale, clenching her flashlight. "This place. It's messing with us." We just turned a corner, hoping to any minute now see an exit, when we entered into another room. The door was partially open and light was seeping from within. I did not think and only pushed the door open to step inside. It was a small room, crowded by some old hospital beds, each one made as if it were to wait for patients. And on each bed, there lay a figure, shrouded by sheets. I began to back away, feeling a chill crawl down my spine as I suddenly realized the sheets were stained, each one bearing a very faint, reddish outline of a human figure. "Jackson, look," Lucy whispered, pointing to the walls. There, scrawled in what looked like blood, were our names. Each one crossed out, except mine. And underneath, in jagged letters, was a message that chilled me to my core. "Welcome back, Jackson. The only ones not scratched out were ours, and mine more so even, stared me right in the face, Jackson. Below my name was the ultimate message, welcome back, Jackson. What was there to see sent whatever ounce of confidence I had left out of me, leaving a dread that crept deep into my bones. Why is it just your name?" she whispered, barely audible, as if it would make everything worse if she spoke louder. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe it's part of the prank, or dash." "No," Lucy interrupted. Her eyes were wide with horror as she looked around the room. "This doesn't feel like a prank anymore." Those weird red-stained sheets shrouded the bed silently and still. Then the air began to thicken and dust smelling with something more acrid, like iron. I tried to pull myself together, clinging to any scrap of logic which might come my way. There was, however, something about this room that felt alive. It was as if it had been waiting for us all this time. Michael flung himself backward, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. "We need to get out, now," he muttered in panic. I nodded, and we quickened our pace back into the hall, both of us frantically scanning for anything that might be a clue to lead us away. But the hospital seemed to curve around us, its corridors twisting and flexing in impossible ways. Every door we tried was either locked or led us right back where we started. "It's like, we're going in circles," Sarah said, peering back as if something might be following. The shadows around us seemed to shift and flutter in the edges of our flashlights. Each time I turned to look, they dissipated, like something lurking just out of sight. My pulse quickened at a sick feeling in my stomach. "Wait," Lucy said, her finger out, pointing ahead at a door. That wasn't there before. It was the heavy, metal door labeled records, the same as the one we'd passed earlier, though we were sure we'd left it far behind. But there it was, the door creaking open just enough to show a dim light inside, inviting us in. "We have to check it out," Lucy insisted, pulling her camera closer. I hesitated, every instinct screaming this was a bad idea. But the others nodded, and together we stepped inside, our flashlights illuminating shelves stacked with old files and folders. The air was thick with the stale smell of paper and mold. As I made my way down the shelf, I found myself drawn to a dusty filing cabinet in the back. My hand shook as I pulled it open, a series of folders facing me, each one with a name scrawled across the front. I flipped through them, my blood running cold as I read each name: Lucy, Michael, Sarah, Jackson. Our files. I opened mine, my heart racing, and read on. The paper was describing me as if I were a patient here, details about my age, my background, even personal struggles I had never shared with anyone. That was creepy enough, but the last page was what really sent the shivers down my spine. In handwriting that looked to be written by a shaking hand, it said, "Patient shows signs of unexpected complications." "What is this?" Michael whispered behind my shoulder. They rummaged through their own files. Faces grew pale as they read the details inside. Each one contained a similar note, they all ended with the same ominous phrase. "Someone's messing with us," I persisted, trying my best to keep the shake out of my voice. "They must have written these, or maybe they found out about us somehow." "But how?" Sarah asked, fear etched upon her face. "There's no way anyone can know all this." Before I could reply, we heard footsteps again. Slow, heavy footsteps, echoing down the hallway, growing closer and closer. We froze, looking at each other in horror. The noise grew louder, it sounded as if something enormous was coming. "Hide," Lucy whispered, ducking behind one of the shelves. We followed suit, ducking down and holding our breath. The footsteps ceased right outside the door. I peeked between the shelves. My heart really was beating. And there, in the doorway, was the figure, its face shrouded in darkness, its body draped in what resembled a hospital gown, stained and tattered. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were listening, waiting. The air grew colder, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The figure took another slow step forward, and with its movement, I heard the slightest whisper, just like voices overlying each other, repeating our names. It was calling out to us. It walked across the room, head tilted to one side as it went down each shelf as if searching. I held my breath, hoping and praying it didn't find us, my pulse pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, it finally turned and walked out, the creaky door shutting behind it. We waited a few minutes before we dared to move. "What was that?" Michael asked, pale, wide-eyed. "I don't know," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But we have to get out of here." As I emerged from the records room, I felt the hospital's atmosphere beginning to change. It was as if its very walls were contracting, urging us towards something we couldn't see. The corridor yawned ahead of us, impossibly long, the shadows it housed deepening, darkening. Just as we reached the edge, we were back inside the therapy room. The chairs were set up in the same circle, except that now it was different. It was waiting for us. Each chair had a name on it, written in dark ink: Lucy, Michael, Sarah, Jackson. "I'm not sitting in that," Lucy said, backstepping pale-faced. Neither did I. The chair with my name on it just tugged at me, deep inside, as if it wanted me to sit in it. I resisted the urge and moved backward instead. That's when the voices came. Soft, overlapping whispers filled the room, echoing off the walls and growing in volume louder and louder until they became a low, droning hum. It sounded like a chorus of people speaking, yet nobody was understandable. I turned to look at the others, and all their faces were masks of terror. Suddenly, as if our fear had been sensed, the voices came through more distinctly now, a chilling unison chant, over and over again: "Stay with us, stay with us, stay with us. Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand as we ran from the room. We ran down the twisting hallways, every turn seemed to lead us deeper into the guts of the hospital. The walls seemed to close in on us, stretching and distorting, twisting into impossible shapes. It was alive, the hospital was, and it wanted to keep us in. Just when I thought we couldn't run any farther, we burst into a small, dimly lit room. Mirrors literally covered all the walls. Each reflected our terrified faces, distorted and twisted. And my reflection stared right back at me, its expression blank, hollow. And then, it moved. I watched in horror as my reflection leaned its head to one side, a cold smile spreading across its face, though I wasn't smiling. The reflections of Lucy, Sarah, and Michael did the same, their faces frozen into unnatural grins which did not match the real expressions on their faces. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. The air was colder now, and I could see my breath in the reflection, but not in real life. My reflection lifted its hand, pressing it against the glass. I felt an icy chill on my own hand, like something was reaching out, trying to pull me in. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling as I ripped my eyes away from the mirror. We stumbled out of the room, the cold grip of the hospital pressing down on us. It wasn't going to let us leave, not until it got what it wanted. And deep down, I knew that whatever it wanted, it had to do with me. We struggled down the corridor, it getting darker and more suffocating with every step taken. The hospital was more than just a building, it felt alive, as if it watched, waited, and fed off fear. I could feel it clamping down on us, twisted walls stretching and shifting to hold us snugly in their eternal, breath-sucking grip. "We're never going to get out of here, are we?" Michael muttered. His voice wasn't any louder than a whisper. He looked wrecked, his face pale, drawn. "Don't say that," Lucy snapped. Her voice shook. We just need to keep moving. There has to be a way out." But even as she said it, I knew she didn't believe it. None of us did. The deeper we were inside the hospital, the more light seemed to flicker on, but the light was weird, casting changed shadows on the walls. The chill started running down my spine, and it felt like fingers trailed along my skin. Not quite the cold, but the air itself just felt wrong, heavy with a presence that watched each and every move. Then, out of nowhere, a voice echoed down the hall. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. "Michael." We all froze, looked at him. His face went even whiter, his eyes wide with fear. "No," he whispered, stepping backward. "No, this can't be happening." It grew louder, over and over until it became a low, droning chant. Michael pressed his hands to his ears, shaking his head as he backed against the wall. I can't stay here," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I need to get out." He turned and bolted down the hallway before any of us could stop him. "Michael, wait." I called, but he had already disappeared around the bend, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, dying into silence. "Should we go after him?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering. "We can't split up," Lucy said, her eyes darting to and fro up and down the hall. "That's just what this place wants." Just as she said that, there was a loud crash from somewhere down the hall and then a series of running footsteps. "That sounded like Michael," I said, my stomach twisting with dread. "Come on." We followed the sound, moving as quickly as we could through the twisting corridors. The walls seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker, deeper, until it felt like we were walking through a living nightmare. The hall terminated at a door, which was ajar, and saw a thin light bleed out from inside. I pulled the door back and stepped inside, our flashlights slashing through the darkness. This was a small room, completely empty except for an old, tattered hospital bed in the middle. But then, what caught my attention was a figure that stood by its side, his back to us. "Michael?" I whispered, cautiously taking a step forward. He didn't say anything. "Michael, are you okay?" Lucy asked softly, almost fearfully. His head turned slowly toward us. His eyes were wide and blank, almost as though he was hypnotized. His skin was pale, almost gray, there were deep circles under his eyes. He looked different. Older somehow, as if he had grown decades in just a few minutes. "Michael, what's happened to you?" Sarah whispered, taking a step back. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, indicating something behind us. We turned, and my heart almost stopped. The walls had writing on them our names, scrawled time and again, in jagged, frantic letters. Each one was accompanied by a date, today. Beneath the writing, in a darker, almost blood-red ink, were two words. "Stay forever." What does this mean?" Lucy stammered. She sounded like her voice wasn't more than a whisper. Scarcely had anyone been able to answer her before the door slammed shut behind us and the lights began to flicker, throwing the room into darkness. I fumbled in my pocket for my flashlight. It refused to turn on. My panic rose as the room noticeably grew colder and the profound silence weighed on us like a 10-ton weight. Then, the voices came out of the darkness, soft, eerie, whispery voices, overlapping and echoing with one another, and louder by the second. They were calling our names, repeating the same chilling message. "Stay with us, stay forever." I backed against the wall, my heart pounding as the voices grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder and I could see my breath in front of me, small puffs of white mist that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. "Stop, please, stop," Sarah whispered, clutching her head as if the sound were physically hurting her. But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, merging into a single, droning hum that filled the room, filling my head, drowning out every other thought. And then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was almost deafening, thick and suffocating, pressing down on us like a weight. I could feel my pulse racing, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. What was that?" Lucy whispered low. But before anyone could answer, the lights flickered back on, casting a sort of eerie, dim glow over the room. And it was then that I saw it. The hospital bed in the center of the room wasn't empty anymore. A figure lay on it, covered by a thin, white sheet. I took a step closer, my heart racing as I slowly reached for the edge of the sheet. My hands were trembling as I peeled it back to reveal the face underneath. Michael. But he looked different, older, wearier, his face creased with wrinkles, his skin pale and lifeless. It was as if he had aged decades in a number of seconds. Michael.no, I gasped, recoiling backward. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open and looked up at me with an empty, hollow gaze. His mouth opened and he whispered one word. Run. I turned and ran from the room, the rest right behind me. We ran down the hall, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the silence, our breaths catching in short, panicked gasps. The hospital twisted around us, the walls folding and elongating, taking us deeper into its dark, smothering maze. Every turn we made, every door opened, merely moved us farther from the exit. It was as if the building itself was alive, leading us deeper to trap us inside. Finally, we stumbled into a large, empty room. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting our terror-stricken faces, distorted and contorted. My reflection stared back at me, its eyes hollow, its expression blank. And then, it moved. My reflection leaned its head, a chill smile spreading over its face, although I wasn't smiling. Lucy's and Sarah's reflections did the same, their faces frozen in unholy, unnatural grins. Something's wrong, Lucy whispered, stepping back from the mirrors. This isn't real. None of this is real. But as she said it, I had this cold, heavy presence settle over us, like this weight was pressing down upon my chest. The room grew darker, mirrors fogging up, and I could barely make out my own reflection. Then, on the ghostly impression of the fogged glass, I saw another thing, a figure, standing behind me, its face consumed by darkness, its hand outstretched, fingers cold and skeletal. Before I could do anything, before I had time to react, he leaned in close and whispered hoarsely in my ear, his voice little more than a breath. Stay with us, forever. It seemed as if a long, long time after the voice had faded out and had melted into the shadows, I could still hear it in my mind. Still, I could feel that cold touch of those bony fingers on my shoulder, though turning around, it was not there. There was just my reflection staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. Lucy, Sarah, and I sat bunched up, flashing our light around the darkened room onto the cracked mirrors. We were deeper into the nightmare of a hospital that seemed to know about us more than we wanted it to, knowing our names, our fears, even our secrets. We need to keep moving, I said, attempting to be firm, when inside every ounce of me wanted to give in. It is only going to get worse if we stay here. But just as I said so, the lights flickered once more and a new low humming noise filled the air. It was different from the voices we'd heard before, more intense, almost mechanical. I glanced around as the hum grew loud, my heart racing with an ominous vibration filling the room. What is that?" asked Sarah, her voice shaking. Nobody was able to say anything, and then the mirrors started steaming up one after another, each one more slowly than the last, until our reflections disappeared. But this time, when the fog finally cleared, our reflections didn't reappear. Other things stood in their places, fragments of images from our past, twisted and distorted. I saw myself as a little boy, standing in the middle of a room in a hospital, holding on to my mother's hand. She had been in and out of hospitals for years, and so much of my childhood was spent in places like this, filled with doctors and nurses. The memory flooded over me with a wave of old pain, and I watched the scene unfold before my eyes as my stomach began to twist with the events. It reflected Lucy as a teenager, standing in that dark street alone, her face streaked with tears. She was so vulnerable and so lost. Even though I knew that she rarely spoke of her past, seeing the image of her younger self made me understand perfectly well why she was always so resolute to put up a brave face. Her reflection showed her sitting at a desk, surrounded by books, her eyes wide with fear. Once she had confided in me about how anxiety burdened her, the strong weight of needing to succeed. The expression in her eyes was that same look when she had been telling me trapped, desperate, and afraid. I tried to look away, but the mirrors seemed to hold us captive, facing us to our own fears. The hospital was teasing out our pain, twisting it, making it real. This isn't real," Lucy whispered, barely a breath. "It can't be." But the mirrors didn't lie. They reflected our deepest fears, our darkest memories, and with images shifting within them, even those began to take on a life of their own. The figures in the mirror, our past selves, turned and faced us, their expressions empty, hollow. And then, en masse, they spoke. "Stay with us. Forever." A wave of terror washed over me, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the reflections reached out, pressing their hands against the glass as if to break through. The chill seemed to seep into the room, wrapping itself around us like a shroud. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, reaching for Lucy's arm, tugging her toward the door. We sprinted down the hallway, our footsteps repeating through the darkness, the mirrors fading to shades with every step behind us. Yet, the hospital was not letting go. The walls twisted and warped, leading us in circles, trapping us in its endless maze. Just when I thought we were entirely lost, we came across a room that looked different. Much cleaner, more modern, like it hadn't suffered the same aging process as the rest of the hospital. A soft, fluorescent light hummed from the ceiling down, casting an eerie glow over the room. There was a hospital bed in the middle of the room with crisp, clean white sheets pulled over it. Lying on the bed was Michael. But he wasn't the same. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, staring blankly at the ceiling. His hands were folded over his chest as if he was already dead. "Michael!" Sarah gasped, rushing forward. But as she approached, he turned his head, his gaze locking on hers. His eyes were empty, lifeless, yet brimming with something dark, something that chilled me to my core. "Why did you leave me?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Sarah froze, her face contorting in horror. "Michael, no, we didn't leave you. We tried to find you." But he didn't appear to hear her. He just lay there, eyes fixed on us, his expression empty. Then, in a voice that sounded far too old, too cold, he repeated the same words we'd been hearing all night. "Stay with us, forever." Lucy grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror as she pulled me back. "This isn't him," she whispered. "It's something else." I knew she was right. Whatever lay on that bed, it wasn't Michael. It was an empty shell, a twisted echo of the friend we'd once known. And as we watched, his face began to shift and contort until it was unrecognizable. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The lights flickered and strange shadows danced across the walls. I could feel the air grow cold, heavier, as something seemed to press down upon us, clenching hold of us and holding us in place. And then, from deep within the hospital, we heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, closer with every passing second. I scanned around, searching for a way out, but the room was sealed, walls closing in, suffocating us. What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the silence, until they were right outside the door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense as we waited, praying that whatever it was out there would leave. Instead, it creaked its way open to allow someone inside. She was a woman in a tattered hospital gown. Her face was ashen, emaciated, her eyes sunken into the skull and hollow. She looked at us with this cold, detached expression, as though we were objects blocking a path. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, barely more than a breath. I took a step back, my heart pounding, as I tried to comprehend what lay before my eyes. Who are you?" I managed to say, though my voice barely reached shakes. The woman cocked her head, her gaze fixed on me. "You came here to see the past," she said, her tone cold and empty. "But now the past sees you." She stepped closer, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air grow cold, denser. Her eyes, never leaving mine, were black with a darkness that stirred in the soul. "Stay with us. Forever," she whispered. It was an echo in my mind. A wave of terror washed over me. I stumbled backward, grabbing Lucy and Sarah. "We need to go," I whispered. But the woman didn't move. She stood watching, waiting, like daring us to try and escape. And as we continued to back away, I knew one thing for sure. The hospital wasn't going to let us leave. Not alive. The cold stare of the woman in the hospital gown held us frozen. Her hollow eyes reflected nothing but endless darkness. Her presence filled the room with a chilly weight that knotted breathing. Each second stretched, and I felt like the air around us was solidifying, trapping us in place. Lucy whispered low, "We have to run, now." I didn't hesitate but latched onto Sarah's hand, and we ran from the room, Lucy at our heels. We tore down the hall, our nerves on end, waiting with every step to feel that cold grasp on our shoulders. What we heard, instead, was silence. It was as if the whole hospital waited, bided its time. We ran until we reached the big hall, wheezing, and then the walls twisted around us and the shadows closed in, though by force we moved forward, and so we had to be very desperate in finding the way out. "This place is a maze," Sarah muttered frantically as she looked around. "We've been here for hours, and we're no closer to finding an exit." "There's got to be a way," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "We just have to." A faint whisper cut me off, making its way down the hall. It was quiet, almost soothing, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Jackson." I froze. That voice belonged to my mother, her voice, just like I remembered from all those years ago, smooth and soothing. But it didn't belong here. It couldn't be real. "Jackson, come to me." "No," I whispered, fisting my hands. "It's not real. It's just this place, messing with us." But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. The others turned to me, concern etched on their faces, but I was unable to tear myself away. The voice tugged at something deep in my belly, pulling up memories I'd worked so desperately to bury. I felt Lucy's hand on my shoulder, anchoring me. "It's not her, Jackson. This place is getting inside our heads." She was right. I shook the feeling off and stepped back, realizing here and now were what mattered. "Let's keep going. We can't let it get to us." We turned down another hall, every step deeper in the maze of the building. But the whispers followed, growing louder, echoing our names, filling the silence with an eerie, hypnotic pull. Then we came upon a door that read "Exit." The wave of relief that crashed over me was enough to make me grab the handle and practically fling myself out of the place. My heart went right back to my stomach as I opened it. Beyond the door lay not the great outdoors but the same hallway from which we had just come. No, this can't be happening," Sarah whimpered, clasping her head. "We're going in circles. It's like the hospital's keeping us here." Lucy clobbered her fists against the wall, frustration and fear chiseled on her face. "This can't be happening. This is a trick. It has to be." But deep inside, I knew it was real. The hospital was alive, its twisted halls shifting and changing, guiding us wherever it wanted. It wasn't going to let us go, not unless it got what it wanted. What if, I gulped, trying to keep the fear off my voice. What if the only way out is to confront it? They just stared at me, unsure, but in that moment, I felt at once more the hospital's presence, watching, waiting. It wanted something from them, something it couldn't take by force. "Jackson," Lucy had modulated her voice after a second with a quavering tone, "what do you mean?" "The files," I said, a realization dawning on me. "Remember those records we found? They were dated today, as if we were destined to be here." Sarah's eyes widened and her head shook with unbelief and horror. No, that's impossible. We're not patients. We're not part of this." "Maybe we weren't," I whispered back. "But I think we are now." A thick silence fell between us, the weight of my words slowly sinking in. The hospital had marked us, claimed us. And I knew deep down that wasn't going to let us go unless we gave something in return. So what do we do? Lucy asked, her voice shaking. Do we just give in? No, I snarled, my hands fisting. We fight. But not by running. The whispers got louder then, whirling around us like some kind of dark, smothering fog. I could feel the presence closing in, pushing down, filling every corner of the hospital with its dark intent. Together, I said, locking eyes with each of them in turn. We confront it together. They nodded, the mix of fear and resolution etched upon their faces. I took a deep breath, before turning and making my way down the hall, back to the heart of the hospital. Each step felt heavier, as if with every step, the weight of the building weighed its gaze upon me. Finally, we came to the center, the great, open room that must have served as a common room for patients. The faded, torn wallpaper hung from the walls and there was a layer of dust everywhere, except for one single unbroken path across the middle of the room. There, standing in the middle, was that woman from before. Her pale face was blank, expressionless, her hollow eyes fixed on us. She lifted her hand, pointing to the floor in front of her. A message was scrawled there, in dark, almost bloody letters. Stay with us, forever. The room grew cold, the shadows deepened, as if the very walls were closing in on us. The woman's mouth moved, her lips formed words without sound. Her gaze never left ours. And then, in a voice that was not her own, she spoke. This place is ours, our memories, our pain. And now you are part of that. The whispers rose around us, a haunting, dissonant chorus, each voice full of despair and longing. It was as if the hospital itself was crying out, a living monument to souls trapped within its cold walls. No, I said quietly, clearly, though my heart was racing. We're not yours. We don't belong here. She cocked her head, squinting her eyes as if doubtful of what I had said. The whispers grew louder and the darkness pressed down upon us, threatening to consume. But I didn't back down, neither did my stare. We leave. And there's nothing you can do to stop that. The air grew cold, and I felt the weight of the hospital's gaze, its anger, its desperation. The room seemed to shake, the walls closing in around us, as if it would swallow us whole. But we did nothing. We just stood, side by side, our gaze fixed upon the darkness until it finally gave in. And then, as if feeling our defiance, the shadows began to pull back. The whispers stopped, the chill dissipated, and the woman's face relaxed, her sunken eyes filling with something almost human. She dropped her hand, and for an instant, I could have sworn her eyes clouded with sadness. And then, in complete silence, she vanished. The weight was lifted, and the room fell silent, there was nothing but silence. The darkness receded, the shadows fading until we were left standing in that empty, lifeless room. We exchanged a glance, relief and disbelief washing over us. Did we do it? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but I was a little uncertain. There was something about the hospital, it was a little too empty, as if whatever had held us here was gone. We weaved through the twisted corridors once more, our footsteps rumbled in silence. This time, the corridors felt shorter, more direct in leading us to the exit. Outside, the cool night air filled my lungs, a rush of relief suddenly pouring through me. We'd done it. Impossible as it seemed, we'd gotten away. But as I turned back toward the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that something of us had remained behind, just a shadow lingering in the corner of my mind. We left that night, knowing we would never return. But I knew that deep down, a piece of us would forever be with them, as bound to that place, that dark, twisted maze where memories and nightmares converged. The hospital had released us, but not because it was finished with us. It had quite simply gotten what it wanted. And as I walked away, one conviction seized me that would not let go. Somewhere, deep inside those darkened halls, the whispers were still calling our names.